and my team members and the forensic people have engaged with Dr. Machila as early as December last year in preparation for this hearing, and we have received from the start, and I place that on record, his full cooperation. The date for this hearing was agreed well in advance to give Dr. Machila proper time and the opportunity to prepare his statement, as he had to answer to obviously a lot of allegations about the PIC and about himself. The agreement was that we would be in possession of the statement of Dr. Machila by Tuesday last week.
Just give us the date.
The date, the 2nd of July. I was advised by my colleagues instructing attorney that they are faced with challenges. We received it on Wednesday, a draft statement. Without annexures, I immediately forwarded it to the Commission. And we also met on Friday last week with my colleague and his instructing attorney, where we were handed a statement in hard copy, 5 copies. I was advised that there were serious challenges with preparing the bundle of annexures, which was an ongoing process till this morning. And still, there is no final, complete bundle of annexures. For the record, I just put it that we have endeavored from the start to give our full assistance to Dr. Machila and his team to come prepared to this commission. All requests by himself and by his team were immediately attended to. And we were, it's not a question that we must provide. We had to approach the PIC, especially Mrs. Wilna Lowe, who did a sterling job, to provide information requested. Unfortunately, we're sitting in a situation this morning that all the annexures are not before the Commission. The Commission is not fully prepared, as I understand, as is normally the situation. But we've mentioned a possible compromise, that we will start with the first part of Dr. Machila's evidence, and that we will then adjourn to allow the Commission to have sight of the full pack of annexures. A matter of concern further is the fact that the statement of Dr. Machila has been leaked. It's already in the press over the weekend, and it's not a question of speculation. There is quotes from the statement in the press. Notwithstanding that, I've discussed it with my learned friend, that by agreement between us and subject to the approval of the Commission, that the statement will be released in tranches. The first 80 or 100 pages will be made available to the press this morning, and then we will make the rest available during the week. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Is there anything you would like to add, Mr. Rulusa?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Commissioner, I confirm what my learned friend has said. Dr. Machila's legal team has faced challenges in getting certain documentation from the PIC after repeated requests, and notwithstanding those requests, certain documentation has not been provided. That has resulted in certain annexures that are referred to in his witness statement not being able to be provided by himself. To that extent, Mr. Commissioner, we have compiled 2 bundles for your use. The first is a bundle in a black file, which is all the annexures that we have to date. And the second is a so-called supplementary bundle, which contains the annexures that have been received late, as well as certain other correspondence that, although mentioned in Dr. Machila's statement, is not necessarily made an annexure, but we have provided it to you for completeness And so that if necessary, if the Commission does want to refer to the content of that correspondence, it can do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we've heard that. The procedure has been thus far that we as commissioners receive the statements a couple of days before a witness gives evidence. It has, of course, happened that at times we receive a statement on the morning of the hearing, which means that we are really ill-prepared as a result of that. We expected to get the statements early last week, early last week, but we received what was referred to as a final version on Friday afternoon or evening, I can't even remember. So in a sense, and it was a 227-page statement that we got, referring to annexures, which we didn't have, and I think they were sent electronically over the weekend. So in a sense, we are disadvantaged and not well prepared for the hearing of this evidence. But of course, we are here. The matter was adjourned till today, and we don't want to waste days. So that's why we are prepared to go ahead. But we do need time to acquaint ourselves with the annexures in particular. It's a big file. And of course, some of us are slow readers, so we're still busy with the statement as well. It's unacceptable that we see in newspapers this morning that there is a write-up about what Dr. Machila's evidence is going to be. It seems clear, therefore, that either part of a statement or all of it has been leaked. We're not going to go into an inquiry as to who leaked and who leaked what and when. And we understand the position that has been taken by council that the statement then be released in tranches. Of course, the recipient of the leaked one might have received the whole statement, and so the others who haven't got the statement are going to be disadvantaged by the making available of tranches of the statement. But I think Dr. Machila has a say in it, and I understand that he's fine with it being distributed in tranches. Okay, so that is what will be done. Anything further? All right, I think we're ready to proceed. Your full names, please.
Daniel Mushi Machila,
Mushi.
Mushi Commissioner,
Oh, Mushi.
double M-U-S-H-I.
Yeah. Machila. And the surname is spelled M-A-T-J-I-L-A.
Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you. Do you have any objections to taking the prescribed oath?
No, Commissioner.
Do you then swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
Budimuntu, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Majila, you are the former Chief Executive Officer of the PIC, is that correct?
That's correct, Commissioner.
And you are called here today in order to provide testimony and evidence concerning the terms of reference of this Commission inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Mr. Olofsson, can I just be sure we've got two versions of the statement? There might be amendments in the other one, but there's one that we've been working on, which was the final version that we got on Friday, and there's another kind of version.
That's the version, Mr. Commissioner, the one on Friday.
Friday version.
Friday version.
Sorry. Yeah. We have 2 copies here. So there's a tracked copy and there's a clean copy with big paragraphs. And the other one is small paragraphs.
Would you just give me a moment to take an instruction, Commissioner?
All right. Okay.
But I understand that you've got the version because the other version is a version that I think we worked on and made some comments for ourselves.
As you please, Mr.
So
Commissioner.
you can go ahead with your version.
Thank you. Dr. Machela, for your purpose of giving testimony before the PIC Commission of Inquiry today, which you're going to refer to in your statement as the Commission, you prepared a statement, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you did so freely and voluntarily for the purpose of assisting the Commission in achieving its aims in regard to the terms of reference.
That's correct, Commissioner.
I'm going to ask you to begin by reading your statement. You can skip the first 2 paragraphs. And I'm going to ask you to begin reading from paragraph 3. From time to time, certain paragraphs will be taken as read, so we will move over those. And at other times, I'm going to interrupt you and stop you and ask you to explain certain things. So would you begin then by starting reading from paragraph 3.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Having been involved in the PIC for a considerable number of years, and indeed, having been its CEO since 2014, I have, with respect, a major contribution to make towards the finding and recommendation as the Commission may ultimately make to the Honorable President, State President, arising from this inquiry. Further, in making that contribution, I'm mindful that it must be completely frank and fully transparent in order to enable the Commission, and equally as importantly, the citizens of this country to properly understand the functioning of the PIC, the events which led to the appointment of the Commission, and my role in them, and the difficulty faced by the PIC whilst I was in the employ. If I may proceed, Commissioner. To that end, my statement is structured as follows. My own background and ascendance through the ranks of the PIC, contextualizing the PIC, the nature and extent of the mandate of the PIC, the extent to which this mandate has been executed under my leadership and impact thereof, the circumstances that led to my departure from the PIC, a specific response to the Commission's terms of reference, and my response to the events and transactions involving the PIC that have attracted media attention and even the public protector's involvement, and the problems in the structure and functioning of the PIC, and my recommendation in that regard. If I proceed to paragraph 5, Commissioner. From the outset, I supported...
You can carry on until Council interrupts you.
Okay. Thanks, Commissioner. From the outset, I supported a commission of inquiry into the PIC and now welcome its eventual appointment. I'm fully committed to supporting its work, albeit as a former employee, hence my submission below. By way of background, I was born on the 18th of January 1962 in a small village of Hararsai in the Northwest Province. After passing my matric with university entrance requirement at Rantailani High School in Harangua in 1980, I took up an apprentice as a fitter and turner at Asia Electric in Pretoria West in an effort to raise funding for my university education. At that time, I earned 67.50 a week, most of which I managed to save. I opened my first bank account.
I think you call it a stipend.
That's true, Commissioner. That's true. I opened my first bank account with African Bank Limited, which was located in Garangua in those days. It was during this time that I learned an important lesson about being prudent with money. This is something that has stayed with me throughout my life, and I'm equally as prudent with other people's money as I am with my own. Within a year, I had saved enough to enroll for my pre-engineering course at the University of Fort Hare in 1982.
Question here. Morning, Dr. Machila.
Morning, Commissioner.
I've always thought you were from Limpopo, so, when I looked at this, I see that you're from Northwest. The Machilas, are they from Limpopo or from that other province, Northwest?
I think they are split between Limpopo and Northwest, and some in Botswana and Namibia, by the way. So we are all over. But I grew up in Garangua, Northwest.
So do you speak Tswana or Pedi?
I speak Tswana.
Oh, Motswana.
But I'm married to a Pedi, so there's a domination of Pedi in my house. Okay. But I accept that.
Oh, Motswana.
Yes, Motswana.
All right, thank you.
Can I proceed, Commissioner?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Commissioner. I graduated from the University of the North with a BSc degree, achieving distinctions in physics and applied mathematics in 1985. And I went on to enroll for a BSc applied mathematics, which I duly completed cum laude in 1986. I proceeded to Rhodes University in Makanda to pursue a master's degree in applied mathematics in 1986, and I graduated in absentia in 1989. In 1988, I took up a lecturing position at the University of the North, UNIN, and in 1990, I enrolled part-time for my PhD degree at the University of Witwatersrand. I was awarded with a doctoral degree in 1994. My doctoral thesis was on mathematical approximation theory, titled The Lagrange Interpolation for Freud Weights. I also hold a postgraduate diploma in mathematical finance from Oxford University in the UK and an advanced management program diploma from Harvard University in the United States. If I proceed, Commissioner. For the last 27 years, I've been very happily married to Susana Sani Machila. We were married in 1992, and together we have raised 3 children, 2 of my own and 1 of my sisters-in-law. They are my pride and joy. My son is 25 years old. My daughters are 23 and 26 years old. I left University of the North at the end of 1995 to join Northern Transvaal Technikon as a lecturer in mathematics, where I spent only 9 months. At that time, as a young family, my young family was growing, I decided to take a break from academia to pursue opportunities in the private sector. My first job was with Anglo-American as a trainee in quantitative asset management, which involved application of mathematical and statistical theory to finance. Financial modeling and computer programming of these models were my main area of focus. And so my new career in quantitative finance began being the development of models for key indices that were tracked to make investment decisions. For example, modeling of price to earnings ratio of the Johannesburg All-Share Index was such example of a model. My time at Anglo was very rewarding. By the time I left, I had risen to the position of a senior manager in derivatives and quantitative asset management.
Question here. Your first job with Anglo, was that within the pension funds? Because did they have asset management companies or pension funds?
Through you, Commissioner, the Anglo group of companies had a huge pension fund that was managed out of Anglo head office, in addition to the normal treasury operations. The BS pension fund, SCORE pension fund, Anglo-Plat pension fund, and many other group companies' pension fund were centralized and managed within the Anglo head office at that time. So we were responsible for that.
Thank you. Dr. Machila, before you proceed, may I ask you to explain to us briefly what quantitative asset management is?
Commissioner, in brief, quantitative asset management is about applying mathematical and statistical theory to finance, developing quantitative models that can explain the evolution of an index such as the price earning ratio of the all share inflation, and many others that you put together through a mathematical algorithm. You eliminate those that do not give you explanatory power until you get something that is close to the trend in the index, and use that as a model to predict the future. That's in essence what quantitative modeling is about. And then using that, you can put together a portfolio of assets. Putting together a portfolio of assets is now about asset management. That's how you apply the statistical modeling into finance in this way.
Thank you, Doctor. You were at beginning paragraph 12.
If I can proceed, Commissioner. As I've mentioned earlier, this position involved development of statistical or economic model from a variety of series data, time series data, to explain and focus movements or direction of certain key indices, such as the price earnings ratio of the all share, future direction of interest rate given the inflation outlook, and so on and so forth. And also designing derivative-based risk management solution to manage portfolio risk or asset level risk. This is where I lend puts, calls, zero-cost collars, fences, and so on and so forth. I also manage a portfolio of blue chip gold shares using technical analysis at Anglo American. If I proceed, I developed good business relationship with main counterparties to Anglo American, mainly banks such as Standard Bank, Rand Merchant Bank, international banks such as Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, Citi, Goldman Sachs, that were in the country at that time, and stockbroking firms and derivative specialists such as Cadiz, Mergence, Peregrine, and I'm sure Commissioner Dilicha will remember Lekhai Securities was part of, and is still part of the pool that I worked with even at PIC. Commissioner, a good working relationship based on trust, integrity, and mutual respect with investment banks and other role players in the investment ecosystem is crucial to deal flow and market intelligence. And this relationship were to stand me in good stead during my time at the PIC as regards its business dealings. I will also be eternally grateful to Anglo, in particular, Ms. Sarah Bretz and her team for giving me an opportunity to be trained in a sector that I had no knowledge about. They gave me an opportunity. But as soon as I became proficient, this opportunity provided a major boost to my career. I also thank my crazy boss, the man that I used to report to, Mr. Doug Kramer, at that time, for being patient with me as I was trying to get up to speed with complex world of finance. an environment for which I was not academically trained. The training I underwent with Mr. Kramer was to have a major impact some years later, as this was the practice that I introduced at the PIC when I became the CEO, giving students from black universities training in asset management through the program called PIC seats within the PIC. Being able to help these students, as Mr. Kramer helped me, was one of the most satisfying aspects of my time as CEO of the PIC.
I hope you won't misunderstand the use of the word crazy.
Thanks, Commissioner. I won't. It's in loose sense. Yeah, in the loose sense. Complimentary. Complimentary. Can I proceed? If I proceed, Commissioner, in 2001, with 3 youngsters to educate, clothe, feed, and supply with Michael Jackson TDK cassettes in those days, I joined then the Liberty Asset Management, which, following a merger with Standard Bank Asset Management, will become Stanlip Asset Management.
I thought that we had CDs by 201. I was wondering, TDK cassettes in 201?
I was coming from academia, so we couldn't afford the TDKs in those days. And besides, we have invested a lot in the TDKs at that time, in terms of music and content, you know.
Okay, Judge still has a cassette, so it's fine.
Thank you very much. At Stanlip, I held the position of Senior Manager, Quantitative Portfolio Management and Derivatives, a position similar to the one I held at Anglo, albeit with a greater scope. Working for Stanlip was an amazing experience. It taught me a lot about the importance of having collegial and collaborative culture that was performance-driven and, most importantly, entrepreneurial. It was also at a time in which I learned the critical importance of giving people free rein to test new ideas and strategy to outperform benchmarks. When given this freedom myself, I excelled, and one of my significant achievements at Stanlip was developing an econometric model for forecasting US equity markets, which I developed together with one of South Africa's respected economists, Mr. Kevin Lings. I think he's one of the best economists with whom I was privileged to work with. I'm told this model is still relevant today. They are still using it at Stanlip. And I hope it has been adjusted or improved to cater for the US president's tweets as well.
Doctor, can I stop you there? You mentioned that you had learned critical importance of giving people free rein to test new ideas and strategies to outperform benchmarks. Has that remained with you?
Commissioner, it has indeed. It has remained with me. I've also tried to do the same at the PIC, to give my colleagues room to test new ideas. Mr. Bulibazi, in his testimony to this commission, did explain the 4-factor model as an example that he introduced within the PIC. And we will show the commission later that it has worked wonders because we've been able to outperform benchmarks. Thank you. Commissioner, in August 2003, at the request of Mr. Brian Molefe, who was the secretary of the commissioners at that time, I was seconded to the PIC to assist in setting up a risk management platform. This was a department to deal with financial risk, which portfolios, the PIC portfolios, were exposed to. An appropriate framework had to be created to ensure that depositors' monies were managed prudently.
Could you just push your mic a little further from you?
This way.
Yes, let's try again.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner, this was to be the start of my career at the PIC in 2003, and it was the most challenging and stimulating time in my life, as I felt a deep sense of pride and responsibility that I could contribute to the financial security of so many South Africans as they reach retirement. And incidentally, that sense of pride remained with me throughout my 15 years that I served at the PIC. Initially, I was employed as a risk manager. My main focus in the beginning was to implement a risk management framework that was developed by Deloitte, which the commissioners had adopted at that time. The framework focused extensively on the treasury function within the PIC, and I had to enhance it to cover key financial risks inherent in asset management. I started to develop a portfolio risk parameters for each of the clients, because at that time, they had no parameters created. And I'll probably explain later on that the commissioners had full authority over all the assets depositors within the PIC. But what was missing, in my view, was a framework for each and every client that defines their risk parameters, risk appetite, and so on and so forth.
Question here. Let's talk about seconded or secondments, which happened around 2003. What was the process of seconding people? You were at Stanlib and taken to the PIC. Were you paid by Stanlib? Were there processes to recruit you? Were there some interviews? Just if you could sort of explain in 2003 what we meant by secondments.
Commissioner, my understanding was that once Mr. Molefe was appointed as secretary of the commissioners, I mean, we had known each other in the market as well as university at that time, and he had good relationship with the executives at Stanlib, Mr. Ben Kruger, I recall Mr. Jacomare, and so on, as well as Steve Hempel at the time. Bruce Hempel, who was managing Stanlib. So I'm told he approached them and asked if I could help set up the risk management. And they agreed, and I was told that I'm seconded to the PIC. So I was paid by Stanlib, or I was paid by PIC, if I understand well. I was paid by Stanlib, and Stanlib would reimburse the PIC. That is how it was done. So you may argue that I was probably handpicked.
Yes.
Yeah.
So was there some process where there were other candidates, or were you just given the job to be the risk manager? Were there policies at the PIC to recruit people by then?
I don't know, because I was on the other side of the PI at Stanley, but I was just asked if I'm interested in this secondment. I said, why can't I do it? I mean, it's a big job, it's an opportunity. So I accepted. I don't know what were the processes and policies on the PIC side. Besides, I was happy to work in Pretoria because I've always lived in Pretoria. I was tired of the traveling to Joburg.
Yes, but did you sign any contract, any employment contract by then, if you recall? The PIC, with the PIC?
I can't remember signing a contract with the PIC directly, because my understanding was that I was the employee of Stanlib. Even after corporatization in 2005, I had to resign from Stanlib to take up a full position at the PIC. So I was 100% an employee of Stanlib, not the PIC at that time. Yeah.
When did you sign the contract with the PIC then, the employment contract with the PIC?
After being appointed the first CIO of the PIC, I signed my contract, I think it's the 1st of April 2005, just shortly after corporatization.
I see. So for the 2 years, Stanlib was paying your salary, but the PIC repaying Stanlib.
Absolutely.
And you were in the employ of Stanlib, basically.
Absolutely, Commissioner.
Okay.
So Sorry, just to be clear on that, I think it was that PIC paid you and Stanley reimbursed the PIC. Is that correct? Or who
Stanley-
paid you? Whose bank account did your salary come from?
From Stanley.
From Stanley.
Yes.
And
My salary came from Stanley, and
And
PIC
it is-
reimbursed Stanley.
and PIC reimbursed Stanley.
Yes, Commissioner.
So the PIC in essence was paying your salary, but you were in the employ of Stanley.
Yes. Yes.
So in many ways, it seems like you were a service provider to the PIC
That's spot on. I think that's
in some ways,
in
because
some ways, yes.
the PIC was paying Stanley for your services.
yes.
Yeah. Looks like.
Yes. In fact, we'll discuss that later on. A lot of professionals that are found at the PIC were not employees of the PIC itself. PIC had no employees. Employees belonged to Treasury, or they were contractors and service providers contracted to perform, certain technical functions like finance, asset management. I was one of those who were helping on the risk side. Thanks. Can I proceed, Commissioner? Yeah. I'm on paragraph 18, PIC in context. When I joined the PIC, I was under no illusion that the gravitas and the significant, I was under no illusion about the gravitas and the significance of the position I held. The position had closed, the PIC had closed the 2003 financial year with 308 billion of assets under management at that time. Mr. Trevor Manuel was the finance minister, and Mr. Mandisi Mpatla, the deputy minister of finance and also the chairman of the PIC. Mr. Mpatla took over from Commissioner Jill Marcus, who was the deputy finance minister between 1986 and 1999, if I'm correct. It then became a tradition in the post-apartheid period that a deputy minister of finance became the chairman of the PIC. This tradition is still in practice today. The Minister of Finance was the sole trustee of the Government Employees Pension Fund, which was the biggest client of the PIC at that time. And it still is. The key depositors at the time were Government Employees Pension Fund, Department of Labor funds, in particular, the Unemployment Insurance Fund and Workmen's Compensation Funds. We had Skills Fund, and from the Department of Justice, we had the Guardian Funds and other smaller public sector funds, including the Auditor General. Those were the depositors at the PIC in 2003 when I joined. The commissioners at that time...
Can we go back to paragraph 18? When the PIC Act was done, do you know why they didn't formalize that the deputy minister becomes the chairperson of the PIC? By any chance, do you know why that was not included in the Act?
We've looked at the Act as well as the previous financial report. There's nowhere where this matter is raised or the reason is given. We haven't seen that anyway. Why they didn't make it formal? Yeah. It's no way.
Like it's no way. So
Yeah.
when Parliament was discussing the Act, it never arose probably.
It probably, I would imagine.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Act of 2005? Or
Yes, 205, yes.
The 205.
Yes, the Corporatization Act, why didn't they include that the deputy minister becomes the chairperson of the PIC? Formalize that one.
Yes.
You know?
I don't know really, Commissioner, I must be honest with you. But what I know is that the minister has powers to appoint the chairperson. And from what I read is that he could appoint anybody. but it appears that tradition was that they chose the deputy minister, but it doesn't mean that the deputy minister should be the one chosen. So the authority lies with the minister, according to the Act, that they can choose anybody. But it just became tradition, it seems.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm on 20, right?
Paragraph 20.
I'm on paragraph 20, Commissioner. The commissioners derived their powers from the Public Investment Act of 1984 and various amendments up to 1995. There were no formal mandates from depositors at that time. The Public Investment Commissioners Act gave commissioners full discretion on the asset allocation of the monies deposited into the PIC. Only the GPF at that time had an exposure to other asset classes such as equities and properties. All the other funds were in fixed income.
Doctor, can I just stop you there and ask, what was the effect of there being no formal mandates for these clients?
No formal mandates creates a bit of a problem in the sense that you are not able to define your risk appetite in a structured way, or the client on the other side does not specify the risk parameters and risk appetite, so that they control the risk that they are exposed to, and in that way they are able to match or get a better handle on the liabilities that they are exposed to vis-a-vis the assets that are being managed by the PIC. So there is a disconnect between the liability side structure and the asset management side of the equation, which is very important, especially GPF in particular at the time as a defined benefit fund. It would have been appropriate to have a clear understanding of the structure of liabilities on one side and structure the assets on the other side so that it talks to the liabilities and therefore possibility of the fund being able to meet its liabilities when due, that defining the nature of the assets and the asset allocations that should be done in the fund. So that's in essence the disconnect when there's no mandate, defined mandate. Thanks,
Thank you, Doctor. Please proceed.
Paragraph 21. The Isibaya portfolio was established in 1985 following the amendment of the Public Investment Commissioners Act of 1992, allowing the commissioners to allocate 3.5% of GPF assets under management to socially responsible investments. Isibaya's main focus at that time was financing black economic empowerment transactions. This is important to bear in mind when considering the allegation that the PIC's investments in unlisted portfolios amounted to a conflict of interest and doing business with friends and colleagues, and the assertion that the investment in unlisted investment should have been suspended with immediate effect. The point is, the amendment of the PIC Act specifically authorized investment into socially responsible investments, among which black economic empowerment transaction.
Sorry, just on this question of the Isibaya Fund, because my understanding, and I'm not sure when you say considering allegations, that to bear in mind when considering the allegations that it was a conflict, who's making those allegations?
Commissioner, this has been in the papers.
No, I think if it's allegations, it needs to be a bit specific. The allegations, because that is an aspect which I have not, perhaps I've missed it, but the question around this has been, there's allegations as a conflict of interest I have not seen. Allegations about doing business with friends and colleagues, yes, but not as a conflict of interest. It was clearly in the Isibaya Fund mandate. But my second question would be, socially responsible does not mean not having returns. Socially responsible includes having returns on your investment. That was very specific, if I remember, in the Isibaya Fund mandate. And as from what we've heard, I think it is 46% of the Isibaya Fund is either in distress or on watch. That's roughly half of the investments. How do you assess that? And specifically the conflict of interest question, as well as an assessment of the performance of the Isibaya Fund in relation to distress.
Commissioner, if I may, thank you for the question. I think if you recall, Honorable Bantu Holomisa was here raising all sorts of allegations about PIC Harith Lebashi and raised possible conflicts around participants in the entities, Lebashi, Harith, Mr. Muleketi's name was mentioned here. As an example, that comes into my mind when I talk about conflicts and allegations that were raised in this commission.
Are you specifically referring to General Holomisa's statements and Harith and Lebashi when you talk about conflict of interest?
Yes,
okay.
Commissioner.
And then the performance of the Isibaya Fund?
I think we will talk about performance later on, and I've done a great deal of assessment as to where the problem is. I think, by and large, the PIC has been caught up in the structuring trap, if I may put it that way, of funding of PE transactions. The usual pref shares with interest that rolls up and so on and so forth. Financially, it has created problems for many BEs, and PIC portfolio is no different because we have those instruments. And I will discuss it in this commission later on as to what sort of solutions we have developed over time to circumvent this kind of thing, where technically you fund equity using a debt instrument that grows all the time. And therefore, if the company that you're financing or the BE underlying company is not performing in line in a way that it will be able to service the instrument, this interest instrument that you've put in, whether it's a pref share or whatever, this interest roll up simply outpaces the equity, and you end up with negative equity in the long term and a terrible portfolio, if I may say that. So
no, but that you're aware of when you made those investments, that is what was. I mean, what is the total investment in Isibaya Fund? How many billions is the total investment of the Isibaya Fund when you were last looking at it?
Yeah, I've looked at it 7 months ago.
Well,
if my memory serves me well, I'm sure it's somewhere in the documents. It should be close to in excess of 100 billion,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
In excess of 100
so
billion.
100 billion, it's more than that.
Yeah.
But we can look up the exact number.
Yeah.
The question I'm asking you is, within that, if roughly half is at risk, that is a significant proportion of investment at risk for the GEPF and other clients?
I think half in monetary terms, but it doesn't mean the securities, half of the securities are in trouble. If you do the analysis, you will see that AfriSem, for example, takes a large component of that underperformance. So in other words, big investments, now lately, if you look at the Stein of Lancaster that we will discuss later on as well, in value, it contributes quite a significant amount in the portfolio. It makes the portfolio look terrible in that way.
We'll come back to the Isibaya Fund and its investment later, but thank you.
Yes, I think
I'm struggling, Chair. I've seen this thing on TV with kids. So it's the first time I approach the mic in this way. So you'll have to bear with me. I'll keep on, getting too close.
That's fine. I'm just wondering whether there is anybody who prepares the record of the hearings, whether that person is listening in and understanding when the mic needs to be moved, so that we make sure everything comes on record. But in the meantime, you may carry on.
yeah, I think just to come through there, in your statement, I think the unlisted side, you mentioned it's 123 billion rand somewhere there.
Yeah.
Somewhere, I think
That
you
would
do
be the
mention
number.
it. Yeah, is that correct?
That would be the number.
Yeah.
Commissioner, can I proceed? Yeah, I'm now on 22. The PIC Act of 1984 and its various amendments up to 1985 gave the Minister of Finance powers to appoint commissioners and to preside at meetings of the PIC. In other words, the minister himself. The Act also gave the minister the power to appoint a commissioner as his substitute to preside over meetings of the commission in the absence of the minister. I think this deals with the issue of the chairman that we spoke about, so he had that power. As I mentioned earlier, the Minister of Finance was the sole trustee of the GPF, which was the biggest client of the PIC at that time. So all we're saying is the minister had authority to appoint the chairperson of the PIC if he's not chairing the meeting. The chairperson, who it will be remembered is the Deputy Minister of Finance, preside over full board meetings of the PIC and is not a member of any other committee, including the investment committee. The chairperson involvement in investment is limited to transactions that are above the delegated authority of the investment committee when these transactions are recommended to the board. In other words, what I'm saying is that the chairman, the deputy minister, never gets involved directly in the investment of the PIC because he doesn't sit on any investment committee or its subcommittee. That's in short what I'm trying to say, and we will discuss it later in detail.
Well, I just want to make sure, are you saying he never gets involved, or are you saying he should never get involved? I don't know what your evidence is going to be further.
Commissioner, I'm of the view that he shouldn't get involved. And this will be part of the recommendation that I make to the Commission. Thank you. This matter is very important to remember when considering allegations against Mr. Nene in the SNS refinery matter, and more recently, the Deputy Minister Mondli Gunguvele's involvement in the Edcon transaction, both of which I will deal with later on. I think my recommendation, that they shouldn't get involved is captured on paragraph 24. It says, the rationale for the chairperson's limited involvement in investment is because the PIC is a major investor in the bonds of state-owned entities or state-owned companies, and hence there will be a conflict of interest in the chairperson, who is also the Deputy Minister of Finance and therefore represent the state, being involved in decisions to invest in very enterprises that fall under the purview of the Finance Ministry. The Deputy Minister is the second in command in the National Treasury, a government department that is responsible for the finances of the nation and the custodians of PFMA. So we believe that it's better if they are not involved in the investment for this reason, that there's a huge exposure through government bonds.
A question here.
It always reminds me, Commissioner, if I may, of the Enron issue where the pension fund in Enron were forced to invest in Enron stock to support it. And once Enron went belly up, the pensions were in a serious situation. That's the conflict that I'm talking about.
Yes.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Just as a follow-up here, when the PIC invested 5 billion rand in ESCOM, was the chairperson involved in that decision?
No, he wasn't involved. He wasn't involved, Chair. Can I proceed, Commissioner? The Secretariat, that is management, led by the Secretary of Commissioners, was responsible for the implementation of the directives from the commissioners and the day-to-day running of the operations. The practice was that a Deputy Director General in National Treasury was appointed the Secretary. The permanent staff of the Secretariats were also secondees from National Treasury. Senior management at the time comprised mainly of contract workers, including secondees like myself. The PIC has no staff of its own, and that made it difficult for the commissioners to attract and retain high caliber personnel that were capable of managing complex financial instruments to optimize return on investment for depositors. That is the challenge of the PIC at that time. So my role as a risk manager was to set up a risk management function within the PIC to optimize returns for depositors. Financial risk management responsibilities focused on market risk, credit risk, currency risk, liquidity risk, and so on and so forth. The key task at hand was to implement a risk framework that was approved by the PIC commissioners during 2002. I took charge of financial risk management while the Chief Operating Officer was Ms. Albertina Ngwezi, and she was in charge of operational risk at the time. During my early days at the PIC between 2003 and 2004, my main focus revolved around fixing the risk function within the organization. The commissioners had challenges raised by the Auditor General at the time in the financial statement during that period. Some of the issues that were raised by the Auditor General were accounting for certain financial instruments was not in accordance with generally accepted accounting practice. Ownership of certain properties could not be confirmed. Concern about accounting for certain structured investment product has been raised. Restructuring of the PIC, in particular, Resources and PIC Act of 1984 did not enable the PIC to operate effectively in a highly specialized financial services environment. There was no internal audit function, and there was non-compliance with the PFMA, which included late submission of strategic plans, and most importantly, the EC buyer fund was making huge losses.
Doctor, if I can just stop you there, what was the broad solution to those difficulties?
The solution, after a lot of thinking around it, was to corporatize the PIC. Already that plan was in place when we came in. It was, being debated, and so we started the process of corporatizing the PIC. And one of the things that really pushed this corporatization was in 1994 when the PIC appeared before Standing Committee on Public Accounts to give account of the performance of the organization and how the underperformance of Isibaya would be arrested. Its value, the value of Isibaya, excluding MTN at the time, the B transaction that was concluded in 2002, has shrunk from 500 million to about 200 million at that time. So SCOPA wanted action on fixing the problems of the PIC. Based on the above, the process of corporatizing the PIC commenced full steam under Brian Molefe. Mr. Jabuli Moleketi became the chairman of the PIC following the promotion of Mr. Mandi Simpatla to a full position of Ministry of Trade and Industry. Mr. Moleketi picked up the baton and led the PIC to full corporatization on the 1st of April 2005 through the passing of PIC Amendment Act of 2004. So the PIC now became a corporation.
Just a question here. Before then, did the commissioners charge any fees? Did they have their own budget, or everything was paid by the National Treasury?
They charged a small fee of about 1.4 basis points on the value of assets under management for operational needs. Things like paying rent, electricity, and some statutory fees. But of course, also to deal with contract workers like myself, so that the companies are reimbursed and the contract workers are paid as well. So it was about 1.4 basis
1.4 basis points. And they did have their own budget. It was not run through the National Treasury. It was an own separate budget.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Commissioner, one of the most significant appointments made during this period was that of Ms. Petro Decker. I think she was here in this commission. She did testify. She was appointed to the position of Manager, Investment Administration. And the reason why I mentioned here is because she brought a huge change to the organization at that time. She had good knowledge and experience of the IT system that was used within the PIC at that time called SmackSoft. So her experience would become invaluable within the organization. And within a short period of time, it proved to be the case. The PIC was able to extract key information on financial risk exposures of depositors' portfolio. The system was also made it possible to compute performance of the portfolio internally on a monthly basis.
Sorry, can we just stay with that a second? Because you mentioned Ms. Decker specifically, and perhaps one can refer to some of her evidence. She said that she started the career in 2004, and she goes through her career, and she said, from 2014, I found the working environment to be hostile and inefficient. Meeting agendas were amended at the start of the meeting. Documents for approval could easily stand over for 3 EXCO meetings before being attended to. Agenda items which did not form part of the PAC and which could not prepare for in advance were added to the agenda. And in the end, she says she forfeited her long-term, she says, and I'll read it specifically. I reached a point where my values and priorities differed from those of my direct line manager, the CFO. I raised these with the CEO to no avail. EXCO members would raise concerns regarding EXCO decisions after EXCO meetings. When I asked why they did not raise their concerns in the meetings, they indicated that this would be career limiting. I realized my reputation as part of a dysfunctional EXCO is at risk, and I decided to resign in 2016. Due to my resignation, I forfeited a long-term incentive allocation of approximately 2 million, which was payable on December 31st, 2016. I could not claim UIF, and I was unemployed for a period of 7 months. That's very different, conveying a very different picture from paragraph 30.
Yeah.
In your discussions with her and her issues that she raised, how did you address that, and how did you resolve it to avoid losing a person that you have said was invaluable to the organization, and she did speak to you directly as CEO?
Commissioner, I was hoping that we will deal with this later on when I address specific HR issues. But in a nutshell, I would say that we've had discussions with Petro Decker, and probably what is not been said, I think the evidence was led by Ms. Mori that I persuaded her to stay, and unfortunately she had put it officially that she wants to leave, and it became very difficult for her to retract her letter of resignation. because I thought she did a great job.
Did you discuss it with Ms. More?
I think we did discuss it at the time.
And was that not soluble between you and Ms. More to have her withdraw her resignation?
I can't recall, but for some reason it became very difficult for us to turn her registration, her resignation. I can't recall what the reasons were, but we ended up letting her go.
So in essence, her difficulties with Ms. More prevailed, and she was not able to be persuaded by, well, she was persuaded by you because Ms. More, if I remember, or Mr. Polwani said that she then withdrew her resignation, but then it was not accepted. So she did leave. She forfeited a significant bonus and remained unemployed. Do you think that was, could that resolution not have been better, could there not have been a better resolution than her leaving? I would have thought that this is something you would have dealt with in terms of your CFO and the CEO taking a decision on senior staff.
Yeah. Look, it's unfortunate that it didn't happen that way, and Commissioner, I can only say that it was a big loss for me, and she left. There's not much I could do about it. You know?
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, I'm now on 31, talking about some of the achievements during 2003 and 2005. We spoke about corporatization, which we achieved in 2005. Good, solid growth in assets under management, growing from 307 billion to 461 billion, representing about 22.6% compound annual growth rate over the 2 years.
Doctor, can I just stop you there? Would you be able to explain to us in brief what the reason for that solid growth was over that short period of time?
Commissioner, I believe that the better risk management platform helped. The fact that we were now able to understand the exposures through SMECSoft, the system that I spoke about, helped so that we position our portfolio properly, allowing staff room to express their creativity was very important as well, added value. When we joined, by the way, if I can just explain this, when I came to the PIC, the equity team at that point were not allowed to sell any stock. Their mandate was to buy the old Z40 stocks, just buy. And it was only the old Z40 stocks. So when I came in, we put together a framework for investing in the full all-share index and also ability to sell as well. We put in place so that we can optimize the portfolio at that time, at any point in time, and that has added significant value to the portfolio. In addition to that, the economy was doing fairly well. We were moving from a period of high interest rates to low interest rate and low inflation environment at that time. And the portfolio structure was biased towards fixed income securities. So that asset allocation really gave the portfolio impetus at the time where we were also increasing the exposure to equities, and equities were also running. So the environment was great. The environment was great.
Sorry, just in relation to that, because yes, that was a period of significant growth in the economy. It was a very favorable environment that obviously boosted correct investment. Certainly had a significant contribution to make to that growth. How much was the contribution of the ongoing contribution in terms of the 15% and 7%, the 22% per pension earning? So the GPF growth in contributions from the civil service employees, and that obviously is then invested. So there was a growth in terms of what was being invested, coming from the civil service itself, which was very, if you like, much higher than now, where you've got a lot of more pensioners that are outflows. How much of the contribution came from the ongoing investment from civil service employees and the question of growth in the assets that were under investment to contribute to this sterling growth of roughly 150 billion rand?
Yeah. Commissioner, that's a great question. We haven't done that in-depth analysis, but I'm sure we can get it from the PIC to do a proper attribution of what was the amount of inflows or net inflows into the fund versus the growth in assets due to the economic environment and many other factors.
So there are three elements, right? Yes. The growth of the economy. So for now, if one had to look at it prior to your resignation or non-resignation, it was a question that says how much would be contributed by a favorable economic climate or an unfavorable economic climate, how much is contributed by the employees on an ongoing basis, and how much is outgoing to service the pension obligation. So I would have thought that as a standard practice you would do that on a regular basis, or is that done through your actuarial valuation? Because I didn't get that number when the actuarial person, when the team with I've forgotten his name now, was from the Alexander Forbes, when they were looking at the presentation on the actual valuation. Because the question must be in your forward planning. So that component, or those different components, how often did you as the CEO ensure that there was that evaluation to determine how well you were fully funded or partially funded, or was it an increasing rate, declining rate, as we've seen with the actuarial valuation, that it is a declining rate, although still fully funded?
Commissioner, between 2003 and 2005, if I recall, the GPF had not been done an in-depth asset and liability study on their funds. So we were getting the assets, sometimes we'll get contributions, sometimes we'll get withdrawals. And therefore, PIC's job was to make sure that there is always liquidity in case the client needs that. And it was a big question, a burning question from the PIC board at the time, commissioners at the time, that we need to know what's happening on the side of liabilities. We're sitting here with assets, but we don't know what's happening there. You know, so that question was asked. All we could, the only question, the only answer we could give was that we are seeing net inflows or we are seeing net outflows, but the fund is in good shape, it's growing and so on. But post 2005, which I will talk about, the GPF did do an extensive asset and liability. So for the first time, we could see how much the assets are covering liabilities and what are the issues that we need to be concerned with to make sure that this risk is properly managed.
So currently, and in the period from then to now, this would be a regular input into the PIC to assess its investment strategy?
Absolutely, that has happened. And to a point which I will discuss later around how we propose a change to the investment strategy of the PIC from as early as 2014, when we realized that the economy is facing headwinds, and that slow economic growth is going to slow asset growth. The good fund coverage that we have enjoyed over time, in excess of 15% or so, is under threat. And indeed, the actuaries did explain here that the GPF used to be 115% covered. They are now at 105. The PIC is outperforming benchmarks. We are doing our job in an economy that's not growing well, and that is a threat towards the state of health of the fund. And we had proposed strategies to put more money in the economy through unlisted investments, because we believe that that's the only way that we can at least help the economy to grow. When the economy grows, the assets will grow and everything will be okay.
Yeah, yes, it's to follow up here, it's quite important to separate those things when we talk about performance, you know, the contributions, the bull market. I mean, as far as I can remember, between 2003 and 2008, we actually had a huge bull market in both equities and the bonds. Is that correct? Isn't it correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Yes, so, you know, in many ways, the assets were carried by the market, isn't it, broadly?
But we can show that the assets were carried by the market, but we also added alpha. We have
Some
added-
alpha, there was some alpha there.
Yes, we put some butter on the
Okay,
on the bread.
okay, okay. So the bulk was the market, but you did add some value to something there.
And again, I must commend the GPF at that time, post the 2005, an extensive asset and liability study that they did that informed an almost perfect strategic asset allocation, which we will discuss later on, you know, developed by Restructuring under the leadership of a fellow called Jared Kransbeek. And John Oliphant was the principal officer at that time, and they put together a good strategic asset allocation that has helped in generating the amount of wealth that we are seeing in the fund, in addition to the additional alpha that the PIC has generated on top of that.
Thank you. You can proceed.
313, some of the transactions that were concluded within Isibaya was invested TISO PEO B transaction, warehousing of the 15.1% telecom stake from Tintana when the Malaysians were exiting on behalf of Elephant Consortium. Those were the big transactions between 2003 and 5. But most importantly, operationally, we started upgrading our IT infrastructure, especially that the asset and liability study was done that pointed towards a more diversified portfolio and slightly complex portfolio that requires an appropriate IT platform to handle. Shareholder activism?
We're going to come back to the IT matters, but if you could just briefly address the questions that came up repeatedly in presentations and testimonies before this commission of the extent to which, I think if I recall correctly, it is the Isibaya funding that is still manual, and that there is a human intervention possible and occurring in a number of areas, not just the Isibaya fund. If IT infrastructure was upgraded as late ago as that is, 2005 to 2018, 19, why would a significant component with huge investments be still subject to manual practice, which allows for human intervention?
Commissioner, the first focus on the upgrading of IT infrastructure was the listed component of the portfolio, which we must understand that it was about 95% of the assets. We were still on SmackSoft. That was becoming obsolete, not supported, unfortunately, so we had to look for something a lot more modern that is commonly used in the investment environment. So we implemented high portfolio system by DST International, and which was widely used in the investment environment, but it's geared for listed investments. We had found it very difficult at that time to get a system for unlisted investments. We even tried to customize high portfolio itself to cater for unlisted investments without much success. We tried to implement a system called eFront at some point without much success. So we've been trying, and we really relied on manual intervention for quite a considerable time period. After these failures, we've tried other customized systems, but without much success, really.
So
the
as
early-
at
so we've
2018, this is still prevailing, this as at when you left in 2018, end of
We were
2018?
still- we were
You were
still-
still manual and unable
And-
to find an IT solution?
And moving aggressively back to eFront. I don't know how far they've gone, but I think I must admit also the implementation project, the project of implementing eFront at that time was not done properly. And we've learned from that. When I left, the team were making steady progress towards implementation of the eFront system. Can I proceed, Commissioner? And then we did shareholder activism in the local equity. I think Mr. Molefe at that time was quite a lot in the news around Sasol, around this and that, Ballowelt, trying to drive transformation and shareholder activism in that area. And then we started refurbishing and upgrading our retail portfolio,
Can I just
especially
ask
those
if-
that are in the townships.
Can I just ask for clarity, shareholder activism was a strategy to either have PIC nominees on the boards, or was it shareholder activism by appearing at annual general meetings, or both?
It was both, Commissioner. We even developed a proxy voting system as part of our corporate governance strategy. We were quite active in that space. I'm sure my colleague Dion Buota at that time used to head up that area. There was a lot of engagement all of a sudden, and in trying to sustain the portfolio by being active.
And inquire, is everybody still fine? Nobody for a comfort break?
From this side, thank you, Commissioner, we're still fine.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm now on PIC post corporatization. This is 2005 to 2010, Commissioner. 32. This period saw the PIC becoming a corporation, a Schedule 3B state-owned company. Minister of Finance Trevor Manuel was the shareholder representative of the state. The activities of the PIC were managed by board of directors, no longer commissioners, all of whom, for the sake of continuity, were former commissioners, as I said. The chairman was Mr. Muleketi and Brian Molefe, CEO. Ms. Lowe, in her statement to this commission, has provided in-depth information about the legal and regulatory regime that applied to the PIC at the time. I will also discuss this matter in my statement under recommendations in response to clause 1.16 of the terms of reference of this commission.
Can we just place on record that this Ms. Lowe you are referring to is Ms. Vilna Lowe, who was with the PIC?
Absolutely.
There is a second Lowe that has been thrown about in this commission, so we need to know which one are we talking about.
This one is owned by the PIC. It's law of the PIC, not the other law. Thanks, Commissioner. Can I proceed, Commissioner? The Board of Directors. The new PIC Act also made provision for the Board of Directors to manage the affairs of the corporation in terms of the Act. Upon corporatization, the commissioners, Ms. Mtoba, Mr. Ignatius Zihule, Mr. John Stradom, Mr. Velin Tombela, Mr. Zexitole, and Mr. Waja became the first non-executive directors of the PIC. The executive directors were Brian Molefe and Ms. Albertina Ngwezi, now Kekana. I was extremely proud to be the first CIO, Chief Investment Officer of the PIC. So I resigned from Stanley to take up full employment at the PIC as its first Chief Investment Officer.
Doctor,
Sorry, go on.
if I can stop you there, what was the date on which you were appointed the first CIO?
1st of April 2005.
Okay, question? Yeah, okay, a question here. So I just want to dwell a bit on this section, this paragraph, because I think it doesn't come up somewhere, you know, in terms of the board, the skills required by the board. Because I know that all these people here, most of them actually, all of them are chartered accountants. If I recall, I think I know some of them. And which is fine. I mean, you know, by then it's fine. The board has changed now. But what would you say are the required skills in a board of the PIC, you know? And as you know, you got legal skills, actuarial skills, IT skills, cybersecurity, and others, you know. What would be the key skills sort of required on the board of the PIC from now on into the future?
Commissioner,
Do you deal with it somewhere?
I deal with it somewhere later on, but I can be quick on that.
Yeah.
What is important is to understand the business of the PIC. It's about asset management. So you will need dominance of directors that understand and have experience in asset management. But at the same time, there's a company to be run. So the body of knowledge of the board as a whole must be able to drive company strategy. IT is critical. It's become even more critical now. Even King recognizes as an important component of business, especially as the commissioner has said, why are we still on manual intervention at this point in time? So as the PIC is becoming even more global, investing elsewhere in Africa, in the continent and across the world, a better platform is required. So you need those skills on the board to understand the IT requirements that will make the PIC a better manager. Legal agreements. Investment, you can't separate investment from legal. Legal becomes an important component of a asset manager's ability to generate returns. If your contracts are weak and so on, you have a problem. Corporate governance itself, you need a strong person that can assist in advising on corporate governance internally as well as in investee companies so that there is sustainability in the investment that we make as well. So you need an HR, of course. You need those skills because PIC relies on people. So you need to understand all of that to put together a board that will be able to drive the affairs of the company, with majority being in investments. And I make a recommendation that those that are in investments, there has to be a process of, you know, fit and properness, clearing them in one way or the other to ensure that they are able to carry out their duties responsibly and effectively. That's in short the nature of the board.
Briefly too, is that what about a person from the continent, you know, from the continent, and what about a global person in asset management? What about engineering skills? I mean, you are in malls and infrastructure. What about those kind of skills? Do you need them on the board?
You do need them, but you also have to recognize the PIC business, that I'm sure it's been said here that there's 2 trillion managed under one roof, and we're trying to be almost 5 biggest asset managers under the one roof, with a board of about 15 dealing with the affairs, investment affairs of the organization. It's a huge task. I mean, later on, Commissioner, if you allow me, I will make a recommendation as to what I believe is the most effective structure, so that you don't end up with a board of 30, so that you are able to cover all these areas. But you can have small boards dealing with certain specialized aspects of the business to be able to give you better service in that way.
You do mention it somewhere else.
We do mention it
I think we
later
can
Yes,
take it
Commissioner.
there. Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
All right, thank you. You can proceed.
Sorry, if I could stay with that paragraph. What would your interpretation be of your sentence? The PIC Act also made provision for the board of directors to manage the affairs of the corporation. Managed by a board? Is it a governance board? Is it an executive board? What was the relationship with the executive? If your sentence is manage the affairs of the corporation, where does the responsibility for the day-to-day running of the organization lie in keeping with that sentence?
I envisage a delegation of authority from the board that directs management on
So it's
how
only,
they can carry
but the
it out.
question is either it's a governance board or a management board. So is this a management board? Was that the interpretation, that this is a management board, and therefore the involvement of your non-executive directors in the actual affairs and committees and working was in keeping with that act? Because the delegation of authority is different from sitting on committees.
Absolutely.
Because then in essence, if it's a management committee, who oversees the management committee of the board?
Yep.
It's overseeing itself.
Yeah, Commissioner, as it is here, it's the board of directors at the top, non-executive directors and probably 1 or 2 executive directors in there, but then they'll have to create a delegation of authority that they will pass on to EXCO executive management to perform the day-to-day activities of the organization under the supervision of the CEO, of the chief executive.
I understand that.
Yes, yes.
What I'm asking is in the working of it, because there's a very different function required from a governance board that sees that things are in place and delegation of authority, and a management of the corporation. You refer here to manage the corporation. What was your understanding? Was it then a board that was part of executive function or governance function? Because this is, if it's simply a delegation of authority, that can still be a governance board. But you use them to manage the affairs of the corporation is, to me, somewhat different. And in practice, we saw a crossing of that boundary by non-executive board members sitting in active decision-making, PMC, etc., part of decision-making in the organization. So was this an area of ambiguity and lack of clarity that led to some of the difficulties that you experienced? I just want to understand how you, as the CEO, understood the management of affairs of the corporation.
Commissioner, my understanding is that we have a governance board at the top.
If it was a governance board, they should not be involved in the...
Absolutely.
A governance board would not have been involved in your committee structures.
Commissioner, my understanding is that you have a board at the top, which deals with governance, and below it will have investment committee. Those committees that meet once a month or whatever. And below that you have executive management who will then form EXCO under the supervision of the executive, chief executive, who would then be running the affairs, day-to-day affairs of the organization. That is my understanding.
Okay, if we could, I'll come back to that later. if you look at your question, you were extremely proud to be appointed the first CIO. Was there an advertised process? What was the process by which you became a CIO in terms of PIC practice? Was there interview? Was there advertising? Or was it simply this is what you had been doing and you're the right person for the job?
My understanding at the time that there was no PIC process as in corporation. As I mentioned earlier, the staff that was within the PIC were seconded from National Treasury, including the secretary. Those that were not belonging to Treasury were mainly contract workers or secondees from elsewhere. The only time that the PIC started its own recruitment policies and really corporate policies was after corporatization. Now, I was told if I'm interested in a position of CIO, and the new board agreed, as I understand it, that I could be appointed, and I was appointed the first CEO on the recommendation of the then Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Molefe. So there was no advert, there was no necessarily a process of interviewing other people and so on and so forth. I was given an opportunity to become the first Chief Investment Officer of the PIC.
Just a follow-up there, and I'm not trying to be difficult or whatever. Were you close to Mr. Molefe? Were you close to Mr. Brian Molefe? Did you know him well?
Well, I would say I knew him well because he was at Treasury playing mainly in investments by and large, raising bonds and quite active in assets and liability. So that is the nature of the interaction. I was also at Stanley at that time in the investment space. So that is the nature of the interaction. We would do road shows to raise bonds with asset managers and so on. You know, so I've known him personally, but professionally as well.
I think let's go back to the board, in terms of whether it's a governance board or a management board. And I'll tell you why. Here's a question. Does the board have the power to hire and fire executive heads? You know, like the suspended Mr. Madavo and Mr. Siani. Just as one question, just to look at this issue.
Currently, the board of the PIC does not necessarily, they do have authority as the board. I assume that they can take any decision, but that has to be informed by executive management making a recommendation to them, because I would have thought that they rely on the executive in terms of the performance of executive and junior staff, because they are not at the coal phase. They don't get to see what's happening in the operation. So that responsibility lies with the Chief Executive Officer to advise the board on performance or many other things, including termination. But they don't get to termination as low as a senior analyst or an analyst. I would have thought it doesn't look good. That should be the responsibility of the manager, senior manager, that they report to.
To ask it differently then, can the CEO terminate or hire the executive heads without the board knowing? Or this must be passed through the board and it's got the veto powers to say yeah or nay?
Chair, in the appointment of senior executive, the MOI, if my memory serves me well, it says that the CEO can appoint, but the practice that I have adopted was that in the process of appointment, we invite, if it's an HR specialist, as an example, we'll invite the chairman of HRRC to be part of that meeting because it's a very high position. If it's IT, we'll invite the chairman of the committee that deals with IT and so on and so forth, you know, so that they at least also advise on suitability of such a person. If it comes to firing, I would always consult with them to say, I have difficulties with so and so, you know, I feel they are no longer able to add value to the organization or, you know, and therefore request that they be terminated or advise or inform them that I consider terminating them. You know. In most cases, they've never said so, no, because I would produce evidence to that effect, you know.
But technically, that area, would you say it belongs to the CEO? If the board says yea or nay, the CEO can decide to go ahead,
I believe,
irrespective of the board's decision. Or
sorry, Commissioner, to keep jumping in here. No. I believe that the CEO must be given space to put together the team that he believes will assist him in running the affairs of the organization. It's good to consult the board. I think it's a good thing to do, you know. But at least the board must give them authority to put together their own team as far as possible.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure of the terminology used in the Act, PIC Act. That first line of paragraph 33, is the word manage used in the Act? No, the first sentence says the new PIC Act also made provision for the Board of Directors to manage. Is that the word used in the Act?
Commissioner, I will have to check. I want to be honest. You know, let me check that. This statement was written by a mathematician, so we may have problems in terms of terminology.
Fine. Okay,
yes.
you can come back on that.
Okay.
But just to add is that the MOI actually says that the company is managed by the board, but of course, as you say, that there are then delegations of authority, you know. So I just wanted to check, those delegations, would they be powerful enough to say the CEO takes this decision whether to hire or terminate employees and all that? Am I clear?
Yes,
Yeah,
you are clear.
okay, yeah.
I think those delegations are clear. Mm-hmm. They are clear in terms of who does terminate, who suspends. You know, they are clear. They are clear.
So even if the MOI or the Act says the board manages this, but once there are delegations, they actually then give the management some powers to carry out.
That is my understanding, Commissioner. That is my understanding, Commissioner.
Does your understanding go so far as to say that the board has authority to suspend or even fire employees of the PIC?
Perhaps we'll have to check that, so we are precise in what we say, Commissioner. But if my memory serves me well, the MOI says that the CEO is appointed by, I think it's by the minister in consultation with the board. The CIO then appoints other senior executives. That is my understanding. And then the delegation of authority, is clear around issues of suspension, who suspends and who terminates. Yes.
Mr. Commissioner, is it perhaps a convenient time to take take a convenience break. That'll give me the opportunity also to place the Act and the MOI before the Commission.
But also the MOI and the relevant section of the PIC Act, because I think this is relevant to the other parts of our, the testimony that has come before this Commission. And that's why the question of a governance board or a management board becomes quite critical. What the law allows.
It's noted.
How long would you like?
Can we make it 15 minutes, please, Mr. Commissioner?
Yes, we'll adjourn until 12:10.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I certainly do. Audio check, 1212, mic check, 1212.
Mr. Commissioner, my apology for starting 5 minutes late. There was a bit of an administrative problem copying everything, but I trust that the documentation is now before the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Roloff, sir.
Sorry, can I just make it? Okay. I think that what we're asking you, Dr. Matshila, is not specifically what the law says or the MOI says, but how it worked in practice. The role of the board in practice and what you as an executive understood the relationship with the board and its role and what authority it had to do certain things and what authority you had. So it's not what, at this point in time, in terms of this, what we would, obviously we've got the information there, but what would be useful for us to get is how you saw that functioning and how it operated. Not what should be, or what the law allows, what actually was in practice.
Thanks, Commissioner. If I may, my understanding is that the board was responsible for governance, ensuring that governance is in place. And out of that, a delegation of authority to management, executive management, that would then operate on the basis of that to run the day-to-day operations of the organization. The only time that the board will get involved or direct non-executive directors will be in different committees that they serve of the board when the board is not in session. Could be non-executive, investment committee, which is the main committee within the PIC that does investments. It's dominated by non-executive directors. And then you'll have them represented in the subcommittees of the investment committee. And these committees meet regularly to assess proposals from management. Management
the PMC
runs
1 and PMC 2.
PMC 1 and PMC 2 would be subcommittees of management responsible for investment. These are committees that either take decisions within the limits that the board has given to them, or they make recommendations to an appropriate committee on deals that are outside their delegated authority.
So what other committees than the investment committee would board members sit on? I'm not talking about your audit and risk committees, because those would be standard committees or subcommittees of a board. I'm talking about the operational side of things.
There's no non-executive director that sits on any of EXCO or its subcommittees.
It's only that
It's
not
only-
NEDs only sit on the investment committee.
Yes.
Other than normal board subcommittees of risk or audit, HR.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it will be the executive, the investment committee, together with its subcommittee, the fund investment panels, the FIPs. That's where non-executive directors get involved. They don't get involved in EXCO and its subcommittees at all.
Let's just check something here just to continue there. Section 8 of the PIC Act says the board must control the business of the PIC. Would that conflict with the King Code? Because maybe the King Code says they must run the corporate governance, not necessarily control the business, Would you think maybe the Act is in contradiction to the King Codes? Do you...
Chair,
the interpretation maybe?
Yeah. I wouldn't be in a position to compare that, but I know in practice within the PIC how things work. The board has a delegation authority as a mechanism of giving management authority to do certain things under their watch. Whether it's control or manage,
Yeah.
the mechanism that they use will be certain delegated powers that are spelled out
Yeah.
in the delegation of authority.
So you would say then it's a governance board. It deals only with corporate governance, not necessarily managing and controlling the operations.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
I think if I may, even in investments, the process of investing is anything that is not within the delegated authority of management through its PMC or EXCO is then recommended to a subcommittee of the board responsible for that, either the FIP or full IC, depending on the nature of the matter. That's the only time that they get to engage on investments through this recommendation mechanism. Then they can decide whether they do something or not do something. You know.
How many board members sit on investment committee?
I don't have the number offhand, but there would be close to 7 or so, 6 or 7. I think we can get that. Yeah. So it will be non-executive director, a certain number, together with 2 executives of the PIC as members.
Thank you.
So continue. Commissioner Amon, paragraph 34, which again, it's almost a repetition. It says, functioning in the same way as under the old Commissioners Act, the new Act provided for the chairman to preside over the full board meetings of the PIC. From 2009, the chairperson also presided over a newly formed board committee, namely called the Directors' Affairs Committee. This committee was responsible for the affairs of directors, such as directors' remuneration reviews and the appointment of PIC nominee directors to sit on the board of companies in which PIC is invested on behalf of its clients. The committee also made recommendation to the shareholder for director that could serve on the PIC board itself if there are vacancies. The chairperson is not a member of any other board committee such as investment committee, nor statutory committees such as audit and risk committee or social and ethics committee, which would be constituted later on. The chairperson's involvement in investment is limited to transactions that are above the delegated authority of the investment committee. So this will be transactions that are now referred to the board because they are above the delegated authority of the investment committee, and that will be the only time that the chairperson of the board gets to see a transaction.
As
which
chair
gets
of
a chair
the board.
of the board, yeah. And I must be honest, it's very rare that we get to that point. It's quite a number of transactions throughout my life that find themselves being discussed at board level.
And that level was 10 billion rand?
Above 10 billion.
Anything
rand.
above 10 billion rand?
And 10 billion rand in certain categories of assets. So it will be in the listed investments that 10 billion will go to the board.
Only in listed? Only in the listed space?
So listed, 10 billion. Unlisted, it's 2 billion.
So unlisted would be, was it always 2 billion or was it reduced to 2 billion at some point? For the unlisted?
If my memory serves me well, it's always been 2 billion. If my memory serves me, it's always been 2 billion. We can check that, Commissioner. We can check that, Commissioner. Further development of the PIC into a corporation, I'm on 35. In line with the new act, the process of applying for the license at the FSB to become an authorized financial service provider commenced. I took the lead in developing an FSB compliant mandate for all the clients. During the same period, the Minister of Finance started the process of appointing an independent board of trustees for the GPF. So for the first time now, the Minister relinquishes his position as the sole trustee of the GPF. This process was finalized in May 2005 with the appointment of new trustees of the GPF. I then led negotiations with the GPF for an FSB compliant mandate. This mandate was eventually signed in 2007.
Can you please just explain what you mean by a compliant mandate and what happens actually? What happens to get to that process?
The process starts with the client appointing an actuary to look at the assets and liabilities of the fund. Once they've done that, they then pass that on to an investment consultant. This will be technical people who are able to run models that can then select the right asset mix, right? This asset mix is chosen in such a way that it gives the fund, once invested in, a high probability of meeting the obligations of the funds when they are due. So that is the asset and liability matching process that is then done by a consultant. Out of that, they will then produce what is called a strategic asset allocation. This is, you can say, is a high-level asset allocation that says, if you put this proportion in equities, this proportion in fixed income instrument, this proportion in property, this proportion in cash, and other asset classes, with assumptions about interest rates and returns and so on in the long term, you are likely to create a portfolio that's able to meet the liabilities when they are due. Then out of that, the client will then craft a set of parameters which are then reduced into a mandate. And this mandate is then passed on to the Financial Services Board, now the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, for approval to see if it's compliant with the minimum requirements. And then once it is approved, it then becomes an FSB compliant mandate. That is the process, Commission.
Do you file that mandate with the FSCA? So
Yes.
you file that, and so that in future they can check whether the PIC has acted in keeping with the mandate. Is that correct?
That will be part of their oversight on the activities of the PIC, because we need to ensure that we comply with the mandate that we've signed with the clients, and they will conduct regular visits if it requires so.
And do you have specimen mandates typically, or you got custom-made mandates which you file with the FSCA generally?
I would say yes, but by and large it also depends on the complexity of the client requirements. If the client gives you quite a complicated requirement, I would say, like the GPF, and say, I want to be in Africa, I want to be in the global space, I want alternative assets, I want hedge funds, and so on and so forth, then you have to customize that, accordingly, but get approval from the FSB. You can customize other mandates, especially those that are simple, for a client that says, we just want to be in fixed income instruments, and we don't want to be in a long duration assets because we have to pay, benefits regularly, maybe it's 12 months or whatever. So you then create a mandate that meet those requirements. So some can be tailored, some can be general and apply to client with simple requirements or not so complex requirements. But they must be signed off by the regulator to ensure that they meet the requirements.
Thank you. You can proceed.
Paragraph 36, in 2005, while performing my duties as the CIO of a newly corporatized PIC, I was responsible for some key tasks that were critical to both the overall well-being of the organization and for the profitable returns on investment on behalf of our clients. The first was developing an investment strategy of the PIC for the implementation of client mandates. So, Commissioner, we get mandates, we need to have a strategy to implement these mandates. So this was my function to say, how do we then invest these monies in these proportions in such a way that we are able to add value to the client requirements? This is what I would then develop as an investment strategy. Concomitant to that task was to ensure that the investment teams are staffed with adequate and appropriately qualified personnel. I assume that some of them did appear before this commission, Mulebati, Siani and them, that we have appointed from the private sector to beef up our ability to deliver on client mandates. Furthermore, we needed to ensure that the investment teams are supported by the right technology systems necessary to implement the strategy. And as discussed before, there have been instances where we are lagging behind for various reasons on the IT side. But as I said earlier, when I left, those matters were being addressed. 37, PIC became a fully fledged asset manager licensed by the FSB in terms of PIC Act of 2006 after registration with the FSB. All top 5 clients signed FSB compliant mandate with the PIC, giving the PIC full discretionary powers within the mandate prescribed parameters. So these mandates are full discretionary mandates. So PIC can act on them without consulting with the client all the time, as long as we are within the mandate parameters with the oversight of the FSB to ensure that we do our job properly. I led the negotiation.
Did any client have, I don't want the power, as it were, to say, no, don't invest there now?
They still have powers to tell us not to do certain things. It's well within their powers, and they have to do it in writing. And the GPF has done so once or twice, and I will explain later those interventions that they made for and what reasons were there for those interventions, Chairman.
To follow up here, this mandate process, would it have some points where, you know, there was COSATU who came here and there was a group called AMA-GP, and they complained that when there were problems at the PIC, they couldn't, ask the PIC questions. They wanted to know what was happening at the PIC, but as stakeholders, they didn't have any power to act, Would a mandate have solved this kind of problem?
If you look at the Board of Trustees of the GPF, the way it's constituted, my understanding is that it's 50% labor or the unions, and another 50% is from the employer. That's the representation on the board. And so the unions will get their voice through this representation on the board. Very little to do with the PIC, because the board of trustees are the ones who craft the investment mandate with parameters and pass it on to the PIC to implement. So it will be difficult for a union outside this process to say to the PIC, you can't do that, when it's well within the mandate that the client has given to us.
So let's say the PIC is almost burning or it's collapsing, you know, how would maybe the GPF and say stakeholders like COSATU have any power to influence it, or is there something that can be done, or that is the forte of the Minister of Finance?
The very first, you know, port of call would be the regulator. Because we are regulated, we have to perform their function, our function, or the PIC case to perform in line with FIRES Act. And FIRES Act is there to protect the clients, the owners of the asset. So if they have a problem, they should run to the FSB and complain, and the FSB will take necessary steps to intervene. The Board of Trustees of the GPF, we present to them on a regular basis. They have an investment committee. In fact, all the clients, they have investment committee where the PIC would present the performance, account for any issue that may be on the table on a regular basis. And there's also interaction, continuous interaction between executive management of the PIC and executive management of the clients. I had interacted with commissioners of the UIF, Compensation Fund, the principal officer, executive officer of the GPF, and so. So there has been that continuous engagement on various matters with the clients.
So these stakeholders then, they don't, you are saying they don't have to go to the PIC, they must start at the FSCA and then GPF and then maybe the minister? Is that
ideally
what
that's what should be the process? Not that we won't talk to them, I mean they are part of the stakeholder, but on certain matters we can't. They should be engaging with the key representatives here, which, I mean, the bodies that represent their interests, which would be the GPF trustees as well as the regulator and the minister, for that matter. Because if they raise issues around mandate, or there's not much we can do, because they are represented in the form of GPF, Board of Trustees would have given us the mandate to implement.
On that score, and I'm sure it's gonna come later and we can treat it then, here's the question. Do you believe that Labour should have board representatives on the PIC board?
I don't have a problem with that, as long as the process of appointing such is in line with the requirements of the board of the PIC, the minimum requirements to make the board effective as it discharges its duties of investing money from the client. If it's the best, qualified, fit and proper as they say, and it's an appropriate process of the PIC of appointing directors and that name fits, then I wouldn't have a problem with that. I would have a problem if it's representation at all costs and therefore costing or hampering the ability of the manager to discharge their duties.
But if I recall, COSATU said they wanted to bring, or COSATU or Labour said they want to bring 3 people, say, and these are our people, and put them on the board, if I recall. Nominated, bringing them to the PIC board, and that's it, just put them on the board. If I recall, that's what they said.
I agree with you, that's what I've heard. We've been to Standing Committee of Finance to discuss the PIC bill, and the position of the PI has always been, it's fine, we want the best to sit on the board of the PIC, and there has to be a process of vetting and ensuring that whoever sits on the board of the PIC will be able to drive the strategy of the PIC, the mandate of implementing client mandate effectively.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, yeah.
Can I just ask you around the GEPF? I would have thought that there would be regular consultation and interaction between the board of the PIC and the GEPF Board of Trustees?
Commissioner, we have attempted to do that. It's not to the extent that we had wanted to. It would have been better, but we've met several times and we had actually a timetable of meetings set up. But it has always been difficult for the two entities to meet. We had set up timetable for board-to-board meetings, timetable for investment committee to investment committee, social ethics to social ethics. Some meetings have happened, but they haven't been many enough, and follow-ups has not been that good. And I think if that had happened, we would have been on the same page a long time ago. PIC and GPF would have resolved a lot of things. And really, board-to-board meeting that happened, I was encouraged that I was beginning to see that there is going to be a fair amount of progress in terms of the relationship between the two and better understanding of how things should be done. But as I said, these meetings were not regularized properly to ensure that.
And if there was an issue with the mandate, surely the Board of Trustees can come to the PIC with a revised mandate?
Commissioner, they have done so in certain instances. They've made interventions. They've written to us to say, look, change this limit to this because we are comfortable with this. And if you exceed this limit, come to us for approval. So those kind of discussions have taken place. SEC to SEC, or social ethics committee to social ethics committee, they have met and discussed issues of ethics and integrity amongst themselves and deciding how they are going to beef up, integrity and honesty within the two organizations. So those discussions have taken place, but I don't think they were followed up with the energy that, they deserve.
Did you raise that as CEO formally within your own board to see what could be done?
Chair, I think we've tried. As I said, meetings would be organized, but
I'm saying, did you raise it within your board to say you're unhappy with the interactions? What do we need to do about it? How do we? So it was a discussion, not just about making appointments, but a discussion in the board about the relationship with your key stakeholder that was not meeting as often as required?
Yes, we have. We have raised those issues. Each time we report to the investment committee, they raise issues that relates to the board of IC. We report back to our board to say, this is what the client has raised and we need to deal with it. And yeah, we've done so, Commissioner.
But where was the problem? You mentioned failure of the meetings that were scheduled to take place. What was the difficulty? Was it on PIC side or was it on GEPF side?
We found it's on both sides. Sometimes the meeting is organized, a lot of people are engaged, and on the one side and so on. So it's been quite difficult to put the two organizations together. And where we have succeeded to get them into one room, there's been significant, progress in terms of what needs to be done. But as I said, Commissioner, unfortunately, that was not institutionalized, so to say. I don't know if they have met ever since I left, but there has always been standing meetings to say, we'll go and see them and explain all of these situations at the PIC. I don't know if that happened.
But generally, were relations okay between the two?
I strongly believe that at management level, the relations were okay.
You may proceed.
Where am I now? 37. Okay. So, Commissioner, we are now on 37. The PIC became a fully fledged asset manager licensed by the FSB in terms of the PIC Act of 2006 after registration with the FSB was approved. All the top 5 clients signed FSB compliant mandate. As I said, these mandates are fully discretionary. I led negotiations with the GPA for an FSB compliant mandate, which was concluded in 2007. The most significant change that they made to this mandate was an allocation to unlisted investments in the Sibaya in particular, from 3.5% to 5% of assets under management to drive social responsible investment. And that was followed up by the development and policy that they crafted and passed on to GPF, to the PIC to implement. We've attached a copy of the mandate of the GPF in Annex DD1. Furthermore, the management fees were then adjusted upwards to 3.5 basis points from 1.2 basis points. And this was sufficient for the PIC to run an effective organization.
Doctor, if I can just stop you there. What was the reason for the upwards adjustment of management fees from 1.2 basis points to 3.5 basis points?
I think the client understood the complexity of the new mandate and what was required to be able to implement that, especially recruitment of the right personnel, as well as appropriate systems to be able to implement the mandates. That's by and large why they increased the fees from 1.2 to 3.5. Now that the PIC owned its employees, meant that the salary bill was quite big and it needed more revenues to be able to deal with that.
And if I can refer you to the GPF mandate annexure DD1, that's in the black file of annexures before you, Commissioners, to page 6. Page 6. Can you explain to us what is going on in respect of this page?
Commissioner, if you are there. If you are there, Commissioner, this is a typical strategic asset allocation, the table that you see at the top there, a typical strategic asset allocation that is informed by the assets and liability study that I spoke about earlier. So from the GPF side, they've given us this allocation to the different asset classes in these proportions, where it talks about asset class, it gives you the name listed equity, unlisted property, listed property. These are different asset classes. And the next one that says asset allocation, it gives you the proportions which we should invest in these asset classes. And it also gives you the range within which you can move. So the target of equities is 53%, but we can move between 40 and 55%. And this is where PIC can add value, because in instances where we believe that equities will do well, we'll want to be overweight equity relative to the target. In instances where we believe equities are not going to do well, you need to be less weighted towards equities, so that if you are right, you can benefit out of that underweight position. So that's how we move between these allocations. And lastly, the last column gives you what is called the tracking error. Tracking error simply means how far can you deviate from the benchmark that they've prescribed. 0 is benchmark. A figure like 1.5 means that you have some room, but it's very narrow. A figure like 5%, if you look at the third line in listed properties, 5% means that you can move slightly wider in that asset class. You can deviate quite significantly, and so on. And these parameters here are set in such a way that the client mandate do not move far away from the liability, expected liability stream in the end. Because if there's too much a wide movement, you may end up with assets that are moving away from liabilities, creating potential risk, especially if assets are not performing and liabilities are increasing. You may have a serious problem. So it's just designed to keep assets as close to liabilities as possible. That's
Just for purposes of the record, you were speaking to page 4 of that, of DD1.
I'm speaking to page 6 of DD1, Chairperson, Commissioner.
It's paginated page 6, Mr. Commissioner, but the actual page 4
Actual page 4.
of the document, but it's paginated page 6.
Yes, okay. Page 4 is at the bottom of the page, at the foot of the page.
Indeed,
Yes.
and the pagination should be on the top right-hand corner.
It's just that mine is not paginated at the top.
I apologize
That's
for that,
fine,
Commissioner.
that's fine,
We
I
will
could
sort that
follow.
out.
I could follow.
And in the middle then on page, paginated page 6 of this document, what is that table?
It shows other assets, in particular, Isibaya or unlisted investment allocation of 5%, and then the range within which we can play, 2% to 8%. That's the unlisted investments. And then lastly, the table below that gives you now the benchmarks of the different sectors. So local equity is measured against SWIX. SWIX is a JSE index, shareholder weighted index on the JSE. Direct property, that IPD, it's an index as well that is calculated by some company, reputable company, and so on. So we know what benchmark we should be tracking and what is the level of tolerance of deviation in each benchmark to be able to comply with the strategic asset allocation on the top, and that strategic asset allocation hopefully giving us asset growth that will be able to satisfy the liabilities of the client into the future.
Thank you, Doctor. If you can proceed with your statement.
Just another quick one here. In terms of the benchmark for the Isibaya fund, just talk a bit about that one also. The benchmark for the Isibaya, I think I see it here is the next table.
Yes.
If you can just talk a bit about it.
Commissioner, is it okay if we defer it to later on, because we do talk about the benchmark
That's
of the different asset classes
Yeah,
later?
that's fine. Yeah, that's
Thank you. 39, other clients such as UIF and Compensation Fund also diversified their asset allocation to broader asset classes following the ALM studies that they conducted and to optimize their ability to meet their obligations when they are due. The vision of Brian Molefe, CEO, which I supported with enthusiasm, was to position the PIC as a client-centric organization with a new ethos that was expressed in the statement, exceeding client mandate return requirements. The next one now talks about PIDF, where it comes from, if I may set the scene that way, Commissioner. In response to the vision espoused by former President Mbeki Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria of the African Renaissance, Mr. Molefe had an ambitious plan of opening an office in Lagos, which offered the PIC potential of becoming the biggest investor in the continent. Teams of experts from the continent collaborated so as to explore the two statements' vision. This culminated in the formation of the Pan-Africa Infrastructure Development Fund, led by South Africans, and the African Finance Corporations, led by Nigerians. Commissioner, it was supposed to be one fund, but for some reason there was an argument around where the head office should be. South Africans preferred Johannesburg, Nigerians preferred Lagos, and they decided to separate and form their own thing. But both organizations are successful anyway in contributing to the vision. So we are happy with that. The formation of PIDF led to the establishment of Harith Fund Managers and mobilization of funds from a variety of investors to commit to the newly formed fund. Harith was set up in 2006 by the PIC to manage PIDF. I think the process of getting there was presented to this commission. I will not get into that if I may. So about $625 million were raised from investors with the inclusion of $250 million from GPF to commit to the fund. Most investors eventually ended up being South Africans, and it's for the same reason that I said that the separation between AFC and PIDF meant that PIDF ended up with mostly South Africans. African Finance Corporation has a variety of investors from elsewhere, much more diversified than the Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund. Some of the investors in the PIDF were Social Security and National Insurance Trust of Ghana and the African Development Bank. Those were the only two non-South African investors in the fund. The table below shows the different contributions or commitment by different entities, GPF being the biggest, followed by Absa Capital and DBSA. The PIC provided about 17 million, roughly. I think this also matter was raised here. As seed capital for Harith Fund Managers. All statutory approvals were obtained as per PFMA because PIC was committing its own funds, the funds of the corporation, and not assets under management in establishing Harith Fund Managers or the Facilitation Trust at that time. So we had to get PFMA approval for that. Mr. Tsepo Matlwele resigned from the PIC but was persuaded to become the CEO of the new Harith Fund Managers. 46. Some investors in PIDF
Sorry,
also...
just to be clear on that, perhaps if we can just check. I wasn't under the impression, but I might be wrong on it, that Mr. Matlwele had already resigned and persuaded. I think he said in his testimony that he was looking to move on and then was persuaded to move from the PIC to Harith. Can we just get clarity whether he had actually resigned and then became Harith, or whether the offer to him to become the CEO of Harith was while he was a PIC employee? My recollection, it was while he was a PIC employee, and I just would like clarity on that.
Yeah. My understanding was that he had resigned, but was persuaded to then go and head up Harith.
We'll get that back from there.
Can I perhaps assist, Mr. Commissioner? In paragraph 7 of his statement, it is stated that the PIC Management Executive Committee identified me, I believe, as the best candidate for the job of establishing the PIDF on the strength of my performance record and expertise whilst employed by the PIC. With effect from 31st March 26, I resigned from the PIC with the specific task of establishing the PIDF outside of the PIC and indeed of all institutions in which government had a stake.
So it was not a pre-resignation and then a persuasion, it was an identification, and if I recall our discussions with him, there was no process of looking for somebody else or advertising or making the job position known. It was allocated to him and he moved from the PIC resigning to take up that position.
That is factually correct.
Okay. Thanks. Can I proceed?
So are you saying that there was no process? You were there. I mean, did you know there was a process or there was no process?
There was no process.
There was no process.
I don't remember. I think we recommended him to go and head up the PIDF as executive management.
But if you recall, there was no process.
No.
Okay.
Like advertising and, no, there wasn't. Some of the investors in PIDF also requested the shareholding in Harith Fund Managers as a condition for their commitment to the fund. All the investors made commitment directly to the fund and not through the PIC. To accommodate these investors, PIC sold 54% of its share in HFM, Harith Fund Managers, to ABSA Capital, 12%, Old Mutual Asset Managers, 12%, and Harith Staff Trust, 30%. Commissioner, my records show that the approval was actually 36% for Harith Staff Trust. PIC has received more than 100 million of dividends and proceeds from the sale of its 54% within 3 years. I think we must have generated in excess of 50% internal rate of return. PIC declared its maiden dividend of 86 million in 2009, mainly out of profits generated from other activities and not asset management. And I say this because there was an issue that why does PIC declare dividends? And we've engaged with Treasury on this matter to say that we will not declare dividends out of profits made from asset management, in other words, the fees that we generate, but will be from other activities. 47?
Sorry, Mahlwele's evidence was that, Mr. Mahlwele, that the 17 million seed capital was paid back in full. You confirm that?
That's correct, Commissioner. With interest. PIC also took full control
Just
of...
a question, another question. So you said that PIC policies developed over time. Around 2006, the human resources policies, were they in place or were they not?
I think they were still being in development.
Yeah, but they were not, if you can recall, they were not fully fledged or in place.
I think there was something in place at the time, if I recall, because we had to recruit quite a lot of people, especially in middle management to lower level. So there was a policy, probably with gaps, you know, which we then perfected over time.
Okay.
PIC also took full control of Advent Asset Management from 60% interest base. Originally, PIC owned 60% of Advent, while Future Growth owned the other 40%. Advent managed the Community Property Fund, CPC. CPC owned mainly township and rural retail property portfolio, which had grown to about 2.5 billion at that time. I think it was lost opportunity in building another Harith in the property space. We should have taken advantage of this. I think this vision was driven by Albertina at the time. But in all humility, I didn't appreciate what she was thinking. We should have done another Harith, a successful property company. The PIC became a signatory of the UN Global Compact and UL principles and the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investments. UNGC is about adopting good practices, policies and practices that support human rights, sound labor practices, managing the environment, and fighting corruption. UNPRI, on the other hand, is about incorporating environmental, social, and governance issues in the investment processes to drive long-term sustainability of underlying investment portfolio. As part of this commitment, the PIC adopted a shareholder activism strategy and developed a PIC corporate governance policy and proxy voting framework to give effect to the UNPRI. In line with global trends and requirements of UNPRI, the PIC made its proxy voting public from then on.
I just want to go back to paragraph 43, last sentence. And this is just a broad question, it's just a broad question. This Social Security Fund of Ghana, SSNIT, from what I understand, it has developed that country in terms of office blocks and student accommodation and factories and all that. Are there other funds in the continent that can develop their own countries? Meaning, are there other GEPFs and PICs in other countries that can develop roads and office blocks, malls, and the other things? Because it looks like Ghana has really done well in that area.
In Africa, I don't know of any such fund, but I know Nigeria set up one, a sovereign wealth fund, probably 6 years ago. And I don't know how big it's grown now. But SNIT of Ghana has been successful. In fact, in my recommendation, I'm saying perhaps the Commission must look at that, how they got it right. Because my view is that in the current economic slump, which we could see 4 years ago, the GPF should have been much more proactive in stimulating the economy and investing in those areas of the economy that would catalyze economic growth and thus create a virtuous cycle, because the assets need economy to grow. But if you have assets of 2 trillion or so, or 1.6 or 1.8 in the case of GPF, which is almost 30% of nominal GDP, then you have ability to influence the economy in one or the other. If you select the right sectors to invest in, you can create a virtuous cycle. I think SNIT of Ghana has done exceptionally well in growing the country, in contributing to the economy of the country.
We can also deal with it later when we get there.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
Asset management activities from 2003 to 2010, taking a bigger window here.
Sorry,
Our
Dr.
CIO.
Sorry, you were CIO from when? Just remind us, please.
I was Chief Investment Officer from 1st of April 2005 to from 2005.
So for 5 years of the period that we're talking about now.
Yes.
Chair, I'm not going to interrupt, but I accept that the Commission will give an indication of when you want to adjourn in the light of the remarks this morning that there will be time needed to...
I was actually aiming at the paragraph that starts at 52, PIC governance, that we end just before that paragraph for the day. Would that be convenient for counsel and the witness?
I apologize, Commissioner.
I was looking at the time.
Yes.
I know we've got to adjourn earlier than usual.
Yes.
For us to be able to study the rest of the statement. And I wondered whether we could go on until we get to the subheading PIC governance.
Yes, I think that would be an appropriate place to stop.
And perhaps just for correction of the document numbers, because it's paragraph 51, but the subparagraphs of paragraph 50.
Okay.
So for future, just to correct that for reference purposes.
Thanks, Commissioner. We got that.
Okay. Doctor, will you carry on reading your statement
Okay.
up to paragraph 52, please?
51, some of the significant achievements between 2003 and 2010. We started the process of optimizing the equity portfolio, building more internal capacity to manage passive mandates internally. Almost 72% of the equity portfolio was managed by Big Four external managers at that time: RMB Asset Management, Sanlam Investment Management, Old Mutual Asset Manager, and Future Growth, which was established in 1994 as a product within the Southern Asset Management, a subsidiary of Southern Life. In December 2006, about 146 billion that was managed by these managers was brought in-house.
This, if I can recall, this was a very serious issue, and these asset managers were not happy at all.
They were not happy. We were not happy either. That's why we did it. And I think they thanked us afterwards for doing it, because these funds, 146 billion among these managers, were big portfolios at that time. And so they were inefficient. The performance was very close to passive mandates. Especially if you add them up, you'll end up with a performance that's no different from that of the benchmark. We were paying a flat fee at the time, no performance-based fees. So we had to restructure, and we didn't restructure and got them to be out of pocket. We did adjustments that still maintain a significant portion of their asset management fees, but put in a performance layer so that if they do well, they can actually even outperform or do better than the flat fee that they used to earn on a large portfolio. So we rearranged the portfolio to push them to drive performance and reward them accordingly. And out of this exercise, we then got an opportunity to bring in black asset managers. And that was the start of driving transformation in the asset management space by the PIC, using portion of this 146 billion to allocate towards black asset managers.
So are you saying, just in terms of fees, it was sort of net for them? I mean, there was not such a big hit.
That's exactly what we did. And
But
by the way,
structured
I know they were unhappy, but we did negotiate with them to say, we are not getting any alpha. These are big portfolios. You can't just move in and out as you please. But if you run a smaller portfolio, it becomes easy to move in and out, and therefore, ability to express your views on a particular stock are easy to implement in a smaller portfolio than a big portfolio. And so the biggest adjustment that we have to make was to make sure that they are not necessarily out of pocket when we give them a smaller portfolio. You know, so adjust the fees so that they are still able to run their operations quite comfortably. So that's what we did.
I'm much clearer now. I didn't know. Yeah, I'm much clearer now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks.
And so this process of moving money internally led to the program of the first public equity tender in the country at that time. And so this equity tender was then to include black asset managers for the first time, the new program of black asset managers. And most importantly, optimizing the portfolio as well, ensuring that we just don't build an externally managed portfolio that on aggregate, if you put them all together, you still get benchmark returns, but you are able to generate excess returns out of the mix of these styles of these managers. That in its essence, what we did. Paragraph 51.5, in addition to this listed equity restructuring, we also looked at asset classes that were not delivering any value to the portfolio. There were lots of structured investment products in the portfolio and capital guaranteed structures and so on and so forth, which in our view were not adding any value. For a long-term investor, you don't need capital guarantee. You need to take risks because you need growth so that the fund can meet its liabilities when it's due. And these guaranteed products the fees were quite high for cash-like returns. You'd expect a capital guarantee product to give you cash-like returns, but the fees were very high. So we restructured those as well into strategies that can add value to the portfolio. Do we stop at 52? This is 51.5, Commissioner.
That's the end of it. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to adjourn a bit early today for the reasons that I've given earlier. Council fine with 9:30 tomorrow morning?
From my side, yes, thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
From our side, we're fine with it, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you. We shall. No, I don't think so. Yes, we shall then adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9:30.